Staff says they're going to make you all walk up to the Capitol. I don't know if that's really the plan, but it wasn't my suggestion, I want to assure you. You know, 2 weeks ago I had dinner with about a dozen business executives, all native Minnesotans, committed to Minnesota, leaders in their industries and communities from around the state. And we went around the table and each one spoke for 5 minutes or so about their perceptions about the state, business climate, what the problems were, opportunities. And I was struck after listening to those presentations about the disconnect between their perceptions and what I consider to be the objective facts. And I suspect that a similar difference exists between most of you and me. In their view, Minnesota is a bad place in which to do business, and I threaten to make it worse. I believe the facts show that Minnesota's balanced approach to taxes and spending and investments in education have made it one of the best places in the country, in the world in fact, to live, raise a family, and run a successful business. They believe, those business leaders, as I suspect do most of you, that Minnesota is a high-tax, high-spending state. The facts show that Minnesota's levels of total taxes and spending are falling relative to other states and is measured by the Chamber-sponsored Minnesota Price of Government analysis. The facts show that thanks to Governor Ventura and Governor Plenty, don't need to thank me, that's the credit of the two of them, and mostly DFL-controlled state legislatures, Minnesota dropped from having the 8th highest level of state and local taxes per $1,000 of personal income in 1996 to the 15th highest last year. 8th highest in 1996, 15th highest last year, according to the formerly called the Minnesota Taxpayers Association, now called the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence, and that chart is the first one on your handout there. Minnesota in 1996 had the 11th highest level of total state and local expenditures, and now ranks 25th among the states, right in the middle. Another measure of Minnesota government spending, which is the next chart on your handout, is the price of government, which was championed by the Minnesota Chamber and others in the early 1990s. In fact, legislation was passed, so now the State Department of Management and Budget makes this computation every year, and it's a good measure. It measures total state and local government expenditures as a percent of personal income. And as you can see from that attachment, the price of government in Minnesota has declined steadily from the 1990s to the present. Now, why do these facts matter? Because they set the context for our current budget debate. If state taxes and spending were spiraling out of control, as your representatives claim repeatedly, then your just cut policy would be appropriate. If, however, major cuts have already been made, there's a better case for a balanced approach, one which combines more spending reductions with revenue and expenditure increases. Your spokesman claims that we can easily cut more state spending without ever specifying where. He recently opined that, quote, there's very little spending reform in the budget. Well, take a look at the next chart, which computes the governor's and the legislature's responses to the budget deficits over the past decade. Look at the volume of fiscal games, the shifting of funds, delaying of aid payments and tax rebates, borrowing, and fee increases, along with major spending reductions. You want to know what real spending reform is? Real reform means that we are no longer using any of those shifts, borrowing, or other gimmicks to balance the state budget. During the past 2 years, we paid off $1.9 billion that was owed to school districts from those previous shifts. We still don't owe them another $800 million. Without those past debts, we would begin the next biennium with a surplus of over $1 billion instead of a $627 million projected deficit, and we would need to consider raising anyone's taxes. We've made dramatic spending reforms in how the state contracts and pays for health care. A recent Star Tribune editorial said, quote, Minnesota has made admirable strides recently to drive a harder bargain with health plans, thanks to the aggressive reforms pushed by Governor Dayton's administration and Republican state lawmakers. The current commissioner, Lucinda Jessen, who championed those efforts, said, quote, these reforms, along with others, have saved taxpayers over $1 billion compared to pre-reform projections. Over $1 billion in savings. That's, as Everett Dirksen said, real money. I'll bet no one's mentioned it to you before. Our proposed budget for the next 2 years would further reform how seniors and people with disabilities receive long-term care. Called Reform 2020, it would better coordinate services so more of them can continue to live in their homes. Its goals are to help people live happier and healthier lives and save taxpayers over $150 million in the next 5 years. Recently, we announced another reform that will change how the state pays for public health insurance so that we will be rewarding prevention and better health outcomes. Minnesota is the first state in the nation to advance this major reform in Medicaid, which we believe will save taxpayers an estimated $90 million over 5 years. The Chamber's response was to cite health care as an area where the state can do more to, quote, provide better care more efficiently. So we became curious whether any Chamber representative had publicly criticized the previous state administration for their lack of budget, spending, or other operational reforms. We went through various archives, and we could not find a single instance of the Chamber calling for spending reform during those 8 years. Evidently, in your view, spending reform is only needed when a Democrat's governor. In addition to those and other major reforms, we have also made very significant cuts in state spending. I'll bet no one has told you about that either. In 2011, the Republican-controlled legislature and I made permanent expenditure reductions of $1,977 million for the current biennium. And those cuts will continue into the future bienniums unless they're changed by the legislature. Some of them were very painful. State support for higher education, the University of Minnesota, minuscule campuses, and financial aid was reduced by 13%. In real, after-inflation dollars, state funding for higher education in this biennium is the lowest it's been since 1980-81, over 30 years ago. Minnesota ranks 32nd among the states in spending on higher education per $1,000 of personal income. And as I said before, those cuts will continue into the next biennium unless they're changed. K-12 education funding is a similar story, although the legislature and I reversed that in the 2011 session. But previous to that, state support had dropped by 14% in the previous decade in real dollars. We went from the 5th highest state in support for K-12 education in 1996 to 33rd most recently. Now, lower spending for things like education are an attempt to lower state taxes. It might be an effective economic development strategy if low taxes meant prosperity. If the lowest taxes equaled the highest job growth and the highest per capita income, public policy would be clear and simple. In fact, however, the opposite is true. If you look at the last chart, 2 pages in your handout, people live in the states with the lowest taxes generally have among the lowest per capita incomes. And those states have inferior job growth. It turns out that other factors are just as and even more important to economic growth. Why do businesses locate and expand in Minnesota? Number one reason I've always heard is well-educated, hardworking, extremely reliable, and productive workforce. That's been our crucial advantage. And the experts tell us that educational attainment will be even more important in the years ahead in determining who succeeds and who struggles. We Minnesotans have always earned our success. We don't have rich oil and gas deposits. We don't have scenic oceans and warm winters. It's never been given to us. And we know it doesn't come free. 1971 is referred to as by many as the Minnesota miracle. And it was a miracle, but it didn't come from up above. It resulted from the largest tax increase in Minnesota history. Income taxes increased by 22%. And the money went to K-12 education and to shifting the primary source of that education funding from the local property tax to the state income tax. Now, I want to assure you that I am not proposing a 22% income tax increase. In fact, I am proposing no state income tax increase for 98% of Minnesotans. I'm proposing no change in the items subject to the state sales tax. Unfortunately, that means I will not be able to lower either the sales or the corporate tax rates, or provide every homeowner with a $500 per year property tax rebate. My revised budget, which will be announced tomorrow, carries most of the $2 billion in permanent spending reductions into the next 2 bienniums. It raises about $1.8 billion in additional revenues, mostly through a 4th-tier income tax bracket and a cigarette tax increase, which provide enough revenue to offset the $627 million deficit projected for the next 2 fiscal years, and to make significant new investments to improve education at all levels, from expanded early childhood education to optional all-day kindergarten for children statewide, both critically important, the experts say, to improving their readiness for elementary school and closing the achievement gap, and all the way through high school and college, especially in training students for the good jobs of the modern era. Those of you, especially in manufacturing, know the jobs that used to, where a high school education used to suffice now require increasingly advanced and very focused skills. And those are good jobs if our young people are trained properly for them. I'm told by Microsoft that they presently have 2,600 vacancies for people with computer science degrees or experience. Starting salary is $105,000. With the benefits package, it's over $200,000 a year. Half my staff are now filling out applications. Wouldn't it be motivating to junior high school students, if they knew that if that were an area of interest of theirs, that they could go through their high school and college and step out into a $105,000 a year annual salary? So both Chancellor Rosenstone at the MNSCU system and University of Minnesota President Kaler are focused on how do we retool our colleges and universities to prepare young people for the jobs of the future, not the jobs of the past. And that means acquiring new curricula, technology, and equipment. But that's an imperative if we're going to be competitive in the world of the future. I've been to China 8 times. I've seen some of those 1.3 billion very motivated, hardworking people going to work 100, 120 hours a week, 50, 60 cents an hour, at jobs that used to be here. I went to one Nike plant outside of Shanghai, and it's a small plant, only 5,000 workers. The large ones, I'm told, have up to 100,000 workers. And they said 250 pairs of hands touches every pair of Nike shoes they make there. It's not high tech, it's not automation, it's just cheap labor. Young men working very hard, perforating soles, young women sewing seams. They're upwardly mobile, they're ambitious, they're not going to stay for all that long, but they're willing to work very hard, and those jobs aren't coming back here. So we and our children and our grandchildren are going to have to out-invent the Chinese, out-innovate them, out-manage them, and outperform them if we're to maintain our world economic preeminence, and better education will be key. I believe that my budget presents a balanced approach to reducing old spending, increasing it in key areas like education and economic development, and a fairer tax system. I expect that the Chamber will oppose it. All I ask is that you oppose it with the facts. Be glad to respond to questions.
Governor Dayton has graciously agreed to stay for about another 20 minutes with us. He will be taking questions. There are 4 microphones set up throughout the ballroom here. Please step forward. We'll recognize you. Please keep your questions short and to the point. Sir.
Governor Dayton, roughly 2.5 years ago, the legislature passed and you signed into law House File 1. And this was a bill that was supposedly going to streamline the permitting process. And granted, this is a problem you've inherited, not one of your making, but I think everybody knows the story of Polymet, which has been trying to get a permit up in northern Minnesota to open a mine which has rich minerals that could be mined. It'd be immediate 1,000 construction jobs, 500 permanent jobs. What can you or we do to get that mine up and operating?
Well, I agree with you that it's taken way too long. It's, I think it's going on 6 years now, and that's much longer than any evaluation process should take. Right now, the Environmental Protection Agency is in charge, and frankly, if I had a magic wand, I'd abolish the EPA, federal one, and just have the state and local governments be responsible. I think these overlapping jurisdictions, duplicative, triplicative, are really dysfunctional and really just drag out timelines. Polymet proposes a non-ferrous mining and a processing of that right up in the area that's close to the boundary waters. It affects the water tables for the whole North Shore, and as well as people who live right in that area of the Iron Range. And it's extremely controversial because it's brand new, and there are, I think, about 90% of the people in Minnesota have made up their minds already for it, against it. It's going to be a very difficult confrontation, no matter what the decision is made to proceed or not, or how to proceed. Right now, the timetable is the EPA, the revised environmental impact statements due in the summer, and then at that point, state agencies, along with the federal agency, will have to start making their decisions and implementing the permitting process. So, that's atypical because of the scope of it and the newness of it. I think we're doing a much better job, at least the agency statistics tell me that, but you could tell me differently in terms of routine applications, permitting requests and reapplications, getting those done. We said within 5 months. Now we're lowering that bar to, or raising the bar to 90 days turnaround, which is our goal to continue to streamline that process.
Any more questions for Governor Dayton? We do have 20 minutes with the governor, so please come up with a question. In the interim, Governor Dayton, I'll ask you a question. You, of course, began your career teaching school, I believe, in New York City. Based upon your knowledge of education and what you've seen, how can the educational process in Minnesota be improved? Do we need to look at teacher standards? Do we need to look at ways to bring people with a non-teaching background into education? What sort of things are you looking at in that area?
Well, the 2000 legislature, again, Republican majorities took the lead in both the alternative licensure, which opens the door for people with non-traditional educational training to come in and become teachers in Minnesota, and also the teacher evaluation process. And there was considerable discussion then about exactly how you should measure, how you could measure, best measure teacher success and effectiveness, and part of it is based on test score results, and part of it is based on observations by principals and others, and that's being put into effect now and will be implemented and start in the fall. So I think we've addressed both of those. I mean, I learned when I was teaching in New York, one bad teacher ruins a classroom, one bad principal ruins a school. And I want every teacher to be well qualified and committed to their jobs, and I think most of them are in Minnesota. I've been in the last decade probably a couple hundred schools and a couple thousand classrooms around Minnesota, and it's another one of those stories that doesn't get told. There's just so much really dedicated teaching and excellent learning that's going on every day. Teachers don't get any recognition or credit for it all. Can we make it better? Absolutely, but it's a lot better than most people give it credit for. And teachers are feeling very, I think, discouraged about the fact that they're not respected by their students or by the community. And I think that's a really tragic loss, and I think it's unfair, but that's the way it is.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Governor, excuse me. Thank you for being here today. I'm an owner-operator of a small hospitality company out in Wilmer and Spicer, Minnesota. And our industry is really concerned about the discussion of minimum wage today. We are very worried that some of the numbers that are being thrown around are quite higher than the federal rate. I would like to get your thoughts on that, but also in the restaurant industry, a recent study has shown that our servers and bartenders are taking home $20 average an hour. And I ask and beg you to understand the need of restaurants in Minnesota to recognize that extra income that those folks are making, and so you don't raise those on us at that time when you're having these discussions. So your thoughts on minimum wage and tipped employees, please.
Well, Minnesota right now, as you know, is below the national minimum wage, and I think that's too low. I think we're $6.15 an hour, and national is $7.50 an hour, and President Obama's talking about going up to $9 an hour. And you know, whether Minnesota should go up that high in one step or not, you know, there are arguments both ways. I understand the predicament of restaurants and bars and those where their employees get significant amount of income from the tips, and my hope is they can work that out. I'm not directly involved in those negotiations. I'm directly involved in quite a few other ones, but this is one where they're going to have to sort it out and come to something that hopefully is acceptable to you and your industry, as well as accomplishes the goal of making work pay. That's my standard. I want the minimum wage to be such that somebody working full-time, 40 hours a week, can earn enough money in the workplace to support themselves and, say, a family of 4 at the poverty level, and then with more training and experience, move up and achieve the American dream. Because if we want work to pay, then we got to pay people for working. And we also, if we don't do that, if somebody's getting less than they need to survive, then the rest of us have to chip in through the earned income tax credit, through food stamps, through all the other ways in which we support people who are underpaid. So I think it's in everybody's interest to let people achieve the American dream through the workplace.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Governor, I'm a small business owner that's responsible for about 86 house payments, number of kids in college, I don't know how many in grade school. Take exception to or have concerns on your 2% Tier 4 seems to parallel the current administration, and many people seem to think that the 2%ers are the Warren Buffetts of the world. I think if you take our population times 2%, you're going to find that that's small business. And most of us are filing Subchapter S. And in that, I think we talk about our family values and how strong this state is, and yet we have a marriage penalty tax on all that. The marriage penalty tax for Minnesota is $200 single, $250 married, $400 for Obama, $450 for married. And that all attacks small business. And we're trying to make it, and yet people don't realize that we're filing Subchapter S, all that's ordinary income. And in our little company, I carry 50% of the employees for 5 months while we wait for summer construction to come. That's at a cost of $200,000 a month. It means I need $1 million for those people to make it. So I'd like you to address that. Thanks.
Well, it's very commendable on your part, and my hope is if we, as I said before, if we get out from under the debts owed from the past and start the next biennium with a healthy surplus, if I'm around, we can look at things like conformity with the federal and abolish the marriage penalty. I commend you for your willingness to carry the employees forward. That's very admirable. According to the Minnesota Department of Revenue, only 6% of all the business owners of Subchapter S corporations and other small businesses, only 6% of them would be affected by the 4th tier. And if you're making above 250,000 taxable income, if you're married, then you're going to be paying a fourth tier additional 2% only on the amount of money of income, the taxable income that exceeds the 250. The numbers, again, you know, the Department of Revenue, there are 54,000 Minnesotans who would be affected by a fourth tier as we've defined it. Their average income is $645,000. And the fact that you can get 2%, raise 2% on the wealthiest 2% of the people of the state and raise over $1.1 billion in additional income shows just how high that stratosphere is. So, you know, I mean, we, as I said before, if we were starting this biennium or the next one with a balance, zero balance, or the surplus that we've earned this last 2 years, we wouldn't be looking at having to raise anybody's taxes. And I hope we get the point 2 years from now where, and whether I'm around or not, where the state can be reducing taxes selectively. But right now, we got a $627 million deficit, and nobody in the state of Minnesota in the last 2 months has taken me up on my request. If you've got ideas of where we can cut spending specifically, tell us where, tell us how. I'm all ears. But you can't just bandy around the word reform like a slogan. It's got to be something real, and that hasn't come forth yet. We're looking for them, believe me. We're going to cut spending every way we can, but we're not going to savage people in the process.
Yes, ma'am.
Governor, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it, and thank you for your support of tourism marketing. I'm pleased to work with you on that initiative. Want to talk about the snowbird proposal in your initial budget proposal, and just wondering, has your position changed in terms of that snowbird initiative with the 60-day residency? We're very concerned about that in the Brainerd Lakes area with over 13,000 seasonal properties in our area and the potential impact that could have. So appreciate your comments.
Well, it's probably unworkable for that reason. I certainly don't want to discourage people from coming to Minnesota for extended vacations or for the summer. You know, my rationale behind the snowbird taxes, I think taxes should be fair. I think people should pay their fair share of taxes. And for people who, you know, leave here, go somewhere where they pay no taxes, come back for 5 months, 5.5 months, use all of the services, take all the benefits that we pay for as taxpayers and don't pay anything, I just think that's unfair. But it's, as I said, also unworkable, and I don't want to. The longer I've been doing this line of work, the more I respect the law of unintended consequences. And that would be, pointed out, an unintended, at least on my part, unintended consequence, and one that probably obviates any way we could structure it. So I wouldn't worry about that one.
Yes, sir.
Governor, thank you for being here this afternoon. In your presentation, you said you'd want to talk about the facts. I want to give you just 2 facts. I'm not as smart as you. I don't have as many people helping me with facts as you do. In 2001, the government's budget, the Minnesota budget, was $24 billion and some change. The budget you first proposed, I believe, was $36 billion, somewhere in that range. That's a 50% increase, Governor. I know it's a long time since 2001. You keep asking us, what would we do to cut the budget? That's not my job. That's your job. I sat, and you asked what I do with the Republicans. I sat in front of the Republican minority leader. I said the same thing. It is your job, it is the Democrats' job, the Republicans' job to work together. And you have to solve this problem. The problem is not the budget. The problem is spending.
Well, I don't have your information on 2001. I don't dispute that. You're correct on the most recent budget. And obviously that's a sizable increase. I'd have to look and see what's driving that. If you give me a card, I will respond back to you. I'll respond back to Mr. Olson. You can distribute it to everybody. You know, you've got to take into account, if you are running a bunch of chain of stores, you're going to look at your, you know, same store sales figures to compare accurately where you stand this year compared to previous years. If you've added 2 or 3 more stores, you're going to have more spending, but that's not an accurate comparison. We got more people than we did back then. We have a lot more kids in school. We have a lot more kids in college. The healthcare costs are, driven, I'll bet, 60 or 70% of what you just described. And I have going to National Governors Association meetings, every governor in the state, in the country, Democrat, Republican, or independent, is grappling with, as I'm sure you are too, the rising costs of healthcare. We have, right now, we'll have at the end of next year, almost a million Minnesotans will be receiving some part of their health coverage through a public sector program, state or federal. That's almost 20% of the people of the state. A lot of whom couldn't afford to get insurance through any other means. Hopefully, the health exchange will open up those doors of opportunity. But we have 200 facilities right now that the Department of Human Services operates for some 85,000 Minnesotans, the elderly and people with disabilities. Those numbers continue to grow. They will continue to grow. So, your point's well taken, and I'd be glad to look in more detail. And I agree with you. It's my job. I'm not trying to pawn it off on anyone else. I'm just asking people to consider when they toss around words like reform, as they say, like slogans, that we're not just being ignorant of that, and we're not cavalier. I don't know anybody in local or state government who, wants to go out and just have a good time spending state public money. It just isn't true. We're all focused on how can we do it better, how can we do it with less. State agencies haven't had a cost. There's been no inflation built into state agency budgets for 10 years. State employees got a 2% raise in January. It's the first raise they've had in 4 years. So we're running as tight a ship as we can. Can we do better? Absolutely, and we will. But but we're conscious of the fact that a lot of factors are driving spending.
Yes, sir.
Governor, I just wanted to thank you for facing a tough crowd.
It's my
we
job.
Appreciate you coming.
I was a hockey
today.
goalie, I had everybody lined up.
Okay. I'm a small business owner. I also happen to run an insurance agency, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where they want me to quote insurance for a business over in South Dakota. They're asking on a continuous basis what workers' comp would be in Wyoming, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and other states. They want to move their businesses over there, and I just happen to have a friend of mine who runs a plumbing company that came to me and said that he wants to put up a call center in Sioux Falls, South Dakota because of your tax proposals. On top of that, you keep asking, where can we cut funding? I also happen to have a father that's a judge that keeps telling me every single day he goes to work, there's a conversation of how many new courtrooms they need. And we have a problem basically with two aspects. One is the judicial system and the number of people that are incarcerated where you're not getting to them soon enough to prevent $30,000 a year in the penal system. And the second thing is when they come into my office and they're on welfare and they have better health benefits than we have. We're looking at many situations, and as myself, I may be hit with your tax, and I'm looking at educating 2 children going to college, yet no credit for having to create another taxpayer in the state of Minnesota.
Well, your mind is already made up, and obviously a lot of your colleagues here agree with you. I'm not going to be able to change your mind with the facts. Facts are that Minnesota ranked 15th highest among the states in job growth last year, and South Dakota ranked 44th. Wisconsin, which is, by the way, open for business, ranked 42nd. I mean, those are just the facts. You can't govern by anecdote. I care about every one of those businesses. I care about every one of those decisions. Somebody's going to go elsewhere, that's of concern to me. But I'm looking at the whole picture and what's best for Minnesotans. And if you think that it's going to be better for the kids, or your kids and my kids and grandkids, for us to keep cutting education funding, it just isn't going to be that way, in my view. It's not going to turn out that way. They're not going to have a better Minnesota. They're not going to live in a better country. And some people I know and well-off say, well, I send my kids to private schools, private universities, I can afford it, they're going to do well. Yeah, they are. But they're not going to do well overall unless everybody's doing well. If the next 2 generations are going to take over when my generation gets even older, are working productively, 95+% of them, we'll make it. Social Security will be tight demographically, but it'll make it. But if only 85% are working productively and 10% are unemployed and 5% are in prison, we're going to have a wrenching of the social fabric in this country that's going to make what we've seen so far tame by comparison. And I don't want to see that happen in Minnesota. I want to go back to what we've done so well that's produced overall, not in every instance. You get on the border, Sioux Falls, now we've got a bigger problem in North Dakota because they got all the oil and gas revenues. But overall, if you look at the facts, Minnesota has been a remarkably successful state compared to others, and especially those in our vicinity. And if we give up that, if we give up everything that's made this state good, you know, we're not going to ever be the lowest tax state, in my view. And we're certainly not going to be the lowest wage place in the world compared to China and Cambodia. So what do we have? What are our strengths that we need to build upon if we're going to be successful? We're going to continue to be successful and competitive. And my budget reflects my judgment on what that is. Others have a different view, and I respect that. That's a great thing about democracy. And you know, we'll see how it turns out.
We have time for one quick final question, ma'am.
Hi, Governor Dayton. Thank you so much. I represent a nonprofit in Alexandria, Minnesota. We take care of over 2,000 seniors. And I want to thank you for being the first governor since Jesse Ventura to actually make a small investment in caring for the elderly. One specific concern that I have, you mentioned unintended consequences, and there is a nurse staffing ratio that's been proposed. And not only would it raise the cost of health care, it would also have the unintended consequence of creating a major nursing shortage, not only for hospitals, but especially on long-term care providers because of the $9 an hour wage difference between the two levels of care. It's one of the hardest things that I personally have to do as an administrator in healthcare is to try and figure out how many staff we need to care for our residents, and I would appreciate your comments on that subject. Thank you again for being here.
Well, I brought that legislation to a halt last year, and I said both sides that, you know, one of the ways we've achieved, maybe you disagree with this, but workers' comp rate stability and administrative stability of the last years is there's a business labor council, and it's equally, I think there are 8 business representatives, 8 labor, and they can't advance anything forward in terms of legislation or changes without majority support, which means they're going to have some business and labor combined. And I think the same principle should apply to this matter as well. I mean, obviously we want hospitals and nursing homes and others to be properly staffed, and there are probably better ways to achieve that than some arbitrary number, which, as you say, does have unintended consequences. And I continue to say to, you know, both sides, all sides, you know, work it out. Work it out.
Governor Dayton, thank you so much for your leadership and service to the people of Minnesota. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.